Hello, I'm Edward Conn, transpersonal psychotherapist and dual diagnosis clinician. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of what acting out is in addiction. Now, this is a term that's also used in psychotherapy, and it relates to a condensed set of feelings and behaviours that get acted out into the environment by the person. And it goes back to early developmental experience and goes back long into the person's history. And in order to understand this behaviour and understand it in relation to addiction, knowing the developmental process and how this happens for a child in a home environment where the child's been brought up, and how that manifests then into a system of behaviour that then becomes the acting out, is central to understanding how this dynamic works and how this dynamic works then in relation to addiction. So I'm going to try and describe this in relatively straightforward terminology. So if you think about a child being born into an environment, the child is in a neutral, unformed state when it comes into that world. And it's formed into an environment which effectively is the structure of the parents. And that's what you call a holding environment, the environment within which the child will be brought up. And the original nascent state of the child is what's considered by some to be called whole. The child is formed in its own neutral way and it's whole. And it then has to grow into this environment around it, a bit like anything that you see in nature, whether that's a seed or if that's a seed growing into a plant, it grows into its natural environment. And if it's in touch with something, it will move around that thing it's in touch with. All right. So the same thing is for a human being, and because a human being is an organic, natural structure, it grows into its environment. And the parents are part of that environment, and the dynamic structure between the child, predominantly the first few years of life, and the mother and the child form that child in specific ways. And a simple analogy you could use to describe this is if you were to take a balloon and blow that balloon up, it would form a round hole shape. But if you were to put that balloon, say, inside a square box of a similar size and blow it into that, the square box would contain and shape the forms that that balloon would take. It would basically, in that container, would look like a square balloon. So that's really what's happening in nature. The child is emerging into its environment, and the interpersonal environmental dynamics of the environment around it effectively act like a form or like a mold to that child. Now, the nature of the human psyche is that it will, like a fluid object, it will form and adapt and in some circumstances split off different parts of itself into that within itself relative to that environment around it. And that is a dynamic system, and that is a developmental process. Now, that's really what everybody goes through. It can't be avoided. And what is then happening is different parts of the psyche are evolving slightly separately and in differentiation to themselves. And what this then creates is a structure within the psyche, which is what we call selves, or sometimes subpersonalities, or sometimes self states. And these are literally like sub parts of the self. And they have character traits and qualities unique to each one. And they act in roles and different ways. So a very common way you would maybe explain this to someone that most people will understand is that the person that you are when you go to work is not the person that you are when you go home and close the door and there's no one at home. You're effectively going into a role, and that role is an adaptive learned system. And it serves a purpose. In that context within work, it serves a purpose and it has a utility, and it meets the ends of what that situation requires it to be. So that is an adaptation, and that is a useful adaptation, and it's also something natural that the psyche does. Now, self states are a natural thing then of human existence. The thing that we don't necessarily understand is that we have them. So that idea of going to work and being the person you are in work and not exactly the same person at home, that is so familiar to us we don't even think about it. We know that and we take it for granted. But we actually don't think about the significance of it because we take it for granted so easily, and because these things happen so fluidly. They're a part of who we are. But this is my point and why I'm making this video. If you understand the significance of that and extrapolate it out into something else of who and where and what are one's other sub-selves or sub-personalities that we slip into and slip out of knowingly or unknowingly, you start to get the idea that you and everybody else has a range of sub-personality states which they utilize all the time in a fluid way without even having to think about it or know about it. And that is the utility of being a human being. The diversity in the personality range is the self-states that person can move through without having to think about it, to get into a different self-state, to do a different thing, act, behaviour, whatever that might be. And it's kind of like changing up through gears. You're willfully moving through those so subtly, depending on what your circumstances are, that you don't have to think about it. But there is, if you think about it, some effort and will and focus in doing that. So if you were going out for a special dinner with friends, you would dress in a certain way, perhaps. You would think about that evening in a certain way, and you would kind of stack up your expectation of what that was going to be like, and you would stack up your sense of what you wanted from that situation, how you wanted to be in it, and you would step in to that role. That is effectively moving into a sub-self of sorts. Okay? So that is the mechanism that I'm describing. Now, when you have such a mechanism and there has been more extreme or challenging or troubling experiences in life, and let's say for simplicity here we're talking about developmental experiences, the severity of those splits and divides can be less or more. And the degree of less or more between them correlates to the knowledge that one has of the other, i.e., how much conscious awareness is between the different selves. Some of you might be thinking now of people who have what used to be called multiple personality disorder, and you wouldn't be wrong in that. That is a severe representation or presentation of the same idea and same system, because the psyche has been under more trauma And that trauma creates more defining splits between different parts of the self which carry different history, carry different memories, carry different subsets of information within that overall psychological system. So if you remember at the beginning, I said the idea was that the psyche exists as a whole. It moves into that environment, expands into it, and it meets the world outside of it, and that can be more or less traumatic, varyings of trauma and non-trauma that create impact on that psychological structure and change it, and it changes also from within. And depending on the severity of that, there is more or less conscious awareness between those different sub-selves or sub-parts. But on the whole, what they're doing is they're operating in unison, in different formats, different times, doing different roles that we move between, and that is utility. So something which creates unison between these sub-selves is the idea of an observing ego, healthy executive functioning, and good metacognition. What does that mean? That means that it's a bit like an umbrella, if you like, over these different parts. The umbrella knows what's underneath it, and it helps coordinating those subcells and understanding what's happening between them as a dynamic management system. Now, where you have subcells which have greater and stronger splits between them, you have less of that management system going on. So what that means is those subcells act more independently. There's less external governance. And that is what then gets into the idea of acting out. That sub-self can enact itself separate from any particular awareness of what might govern that by a meta position on observing self in one's own self-awareness, which is monitoring that. Effectively, you could say it goes rogue. It becomes conscious, it wakens up, and its behaviour then plays out because it is a particular personality. So that is often what's happening in addiction. A sub-self has evolved over a period of time through life, and particularly in adolescence, that person in adolescence has come across drugs or alcohol or whatever it might be, and incorporated those substances into their life as an extension of themselves, as a set of behaviours, as a way of escaping from the world, perhaps a way of just having fun, a way of hanging out with people, maybe getting away from parents. Rebelliousness is also part of adolescence, and it becomes infused within that sub-self as a pleasure system. And this is the pleasure-seeking element within a sub-self, which can also be within an addictive pattern that sub-self might be enacting. It is pleasure-seeking, it is the pleasure principle. And what is underneath that in the pleasure principle is the avoidance of underlying pain. So, taking it back to those failures in the holding environment of the child, those failures are recorded emotionally within the psyche as a pain. And we call this the abandonment depression, or sometimes it might be referred to just simply as the underlying depression. And what it essentially is a container of pain. And the sub-self has evolved and sought pleasure out as an antidote to that pain. It stays away from the pain. It seeks pleasure to get away from the pain. And that is a mirroring of the failure of the parental environment, because that sub-self, when it was part of a self, it sought that union with the object of, perfect union with the object of the parent, who wasn't able to reciprocate that in every moment and repair those failures. And the sub-self grows, emerges into that, trying to maintain that idealized self representation of the object and the idealized representation of itself as well. So its structures become orientated around for this need for maintaining idealization. An idealization at any cost. In the absence of idealization, it potentially slips into awareness of the underlying depression and discomfort. So how might this work then in an addictive pattern? Well, generally what will happen is that person doesn't know that they've got sub-selves. And as I said, these are common to all of us. But what happens is sub-selves will be triggered by certain things. And those things might be mirrors of things that we've long forgotten. So that could be having an argument with a spouse. That could be getting ticked off at work. That could be going through some sort of distress in your environment that gets into those fissures within oneself and activate that potential pain underneath, that abandonment anxiety, that abandonment depression, and start to get into that pool of pain that sits somewhere deep within the psyche. That then activates one of these sub-selves, which then knows what it wants to do. It wants to go and seek pleasure. It becomes activated, and because it's got a mind of its own, because it's unconscious, not unconscious awareness, it becomes a predominant personality of that person. And they find themselves in that personality without knowing they're in that personality, but the personality and the behaviour are as one. So they'll find themselves going down the shop and buying alcohol. They'll find themselves at a party outrageously drunk. They'll find themselves buying cocaine, whatever it might be. And the behaviour and the person and the pain are part of a chain. The pain triggers the sub-self, and the sub-self enacts the behaviour, which acts as a defence from awakening the underlying pain. So if you understand from an addictive point of view how people may often report that it doesn't feel like them that's doing this behaviour, why they can't understand why they do it, why it feels out of character, why when they're then back in the sober world that they're full of shame and remorse and whatever else it might be, it's because of this sub-self underlying structure which is causing that, because there's an unconscious link between that self structure and another sense of self, which is that sober person back in the real world. There is a missing link of memory between the two. It's split off. So when it enacts, you become all that and not the other, the one that you were before. And then when it's played out, it's discharged out, and the threat of that abandonment depression has been avoided, you wake up and life's turned upside down. So understanding this helps you to understand the underlying mechanism psychologically that is potentially driving that addictive behaviour. It is a sub-self. Now, in my treatment process, this is something that sometimes needs to be addressed. It doesn't present for everybody, but it presents for some people. And there can be different ways of addressing this. Sometimes you simply can't address it head on because a sub-self will not respond to reason, because it's not a self-conscious part of oneself. So it doesn't respond to reason. Sometimes it will act out, and that person can separate from it and remove themselves from it because of the catastrophe of what it's caused. They're in therapy, and these things can then be taken apart and examined and understood, and the therapy can make sense of what's happening there. Sometimes you can invoke the metacognitive position and the executive functioning and greater self-awareness, observing self, and utilize that to bring various sub-selves in under the umbrella of awareness, and utilize that, which would be a core technique anyway. And so, as I say, sometimes you're not able to do that. That alone will not do it. So I'm sharing this to explain the unconscious element of an addiction, that it isn't something that can't be understood, that there is actually a psychological structure that's happening there that explains that. And it's something that we all have in varying degrees, and it's part of a dynamic system of your psyche. And good therapy and a good therapeutic approach within an addictive model that understands this, with a therapist that understands the various different presentations that might happen for different people with very different degrees and severities of addictions, can enable some light to be shed on that, and a constructive approach created which fits with that person's individual circumstances. And that's one of the things about addiction. There's all sorts of different presentations, which is what makes it a highly complex area. All sorts of different behavioural styles of addiction, various different reasons why it's driven, different degrees and permutations of addictions. And you need to have a really thorough understanding of so many of those to be effective in what you're doing, as well as a tried and tested model that addresses those functional components psychologically and the behaviour from a dynamic way that has been shown to be effective. And it explains why, in some ways, why trying to resolve your addiction yourself can be such a futile experience. Because this unconscious element, and not being able to get into that and understand it, is a constant source of frustration because you cannot see yourself. And this is again why it's important to work with someone who really knows what they're talking about, who can see you and can see what's going on and can explain that to you as it's unfolding and it's happening. Because that awareness that's coming in from outside is the healing process of bringing awareness to the invisible part of that person and enabling that person then to see that themselves. And in the seeing of that in their own awareness, they begin to integrate those ununderstood parts, which are understood because they're outside of awareness and they're outside of the ability to understand them. And that is effectively the mirroring, intellectual, knowledgeable position that a good therapist is able to take. They enable integration to happen. And that is the way that the addiction has to be healed. Now, this varies from the traditional 12-step model, in part, but not in whole. So what I'm talking about here is what we call secondary recovery, as opposed to what the 12-step model predominates really with theoretically, but not entirely, is what you would call primary recovery. Primary recovery is the stopping of the behaviour itself. And the stopping of the behaviour resolves the acting out. In psychological terms, you might call that containment, containing the acting out. But it doesn't get into the underlying structure of what has been driving that. It doesn't get into the healing of the integrating of those split aspects of the psyche and bringing them back into meta-awareness. So what secondary recovery is from a psychotherapeutic model is recovering the lost elements of the self that are not integrated, which are outside of awareness, unconscious, and need to be worked through so they can become part of the self and resolved and become under the governance of the self-awareness and knowledge and knowing of the person themselves. That's effectively healing the history of the person, and that's what secondary recovery is. It's healing the roots of what's going on for that person. So secondary recovery is the model which I utilize, and how that needs to be utilized from person to person varies, because each person is unique and their story is unique, and their story is the territory of what one needs to work through, as well as tackle the actual behaviour itself from a head-on point of view. Those two things need to be integrated. So this is what acting out is. This is what selves are. That is what the abandonment depression or the underlying pain is, and how these relate to natural structures in the psyche, which are dynamic and evolve and emerge directly relevant to their external environment. So I hope you found this useful. If you want to know anything more, I'm available for one-to-one sessions. You can contact me in the link below where my website is. And thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.